On this DVD, Alan is continuing his sculpting and finishing the components in high detail.
Okay, now let's get started on this buffalo. First thing I have to do is get all the screws out of it. Some of those long ones you gotta help along a little bit by holding in and pulling, because there's no threads right at the end of those. Now I'm going to put some thick paper here. I want to build out this part of the buffalo. It got a little thin when I put it together. Wasn't as thick as my original sculpture, so I'm going to build it out. And here I'm going to use some of that pulp to do that with. It goes on really thick and fast. And then thinner paper to smooth it a little bit. I'll use my knife to cut away some of these areas and smooth those by, of course, wetting it and then chasing it in. Now I'm going to take off some of these legs. I'll reattach them later. Use my knife and my razor saw. Get the back leg off. Take the front ones off too. I'll reattach those later. Meanwhile, I'm back to work on him. Now I've got the buffalo up a little more to my liking. Here I'm going to make the tail. So I'll take a wire and put it on my triangle there. It's a fairly thick sheet, number 5 sheet that I'm using. That'll give me a little thickness. When I make a triangle like this, then it's thicker at the base of the tail than at the tip, obviously. Wet a little more there with some bonding agent, and then I'll take my burnisher and I'll burnish it a little bit after I've wet it again. Then I'm going to pull that wire out. That's where I'm going to put it. Now I'm going to bend it just to get the shape I want on this, because I didn't cast it. And the reason I didn't cast it is because I would just as soon sculpt each one. I can't get the detail on the tip with the hair anyway, so I'll just sculpt each one. Doesn't take that much to do it, and then each one is a little different. Now I'm going to dry this and take the dry tail and I'll hit it with the burnisher, do a little dry burnishing. Right there where I'm going to put the hair on the tail, I'm going to make it a little thinner by using my knife and taking off some areas that I don't want. Now I'll wet the tail with the bonding agent using a small brush and let it soak in a little just to soften that paper on the surface. And now I'll drive that bonding agent in as I smooth. This is a lot like sanding wood to get it smooth. Now let's go back to work on the rider. Let's get his moccasins finished first. So I'll flatten out the bottom of his foot where that cast was. Those little divots I'm going to fill with some soft paper using the thickness of the paper that makes the most sense, tearing it and filling it in. I tear these sheets because that torn edge really feathers in nice and works a little better than cutting it. And then I just tear the sizes that I want on those little ready sheets, painting them on and then burnishing it. It's called sculpting, just like adding clay if you're working on a clay sculpture. So I'm actually flattening the bottom of that, and that could be a nice bottom to his moccasin, but it's not going to be. I'm going to work a little more on the side here before I show you how I get both these feet the same size on this rider. That's a template that I use on my 1/6 life-size man for a moccasin, and I'm pinning it in place on a 1/16 inch hard board. Some of our paper, trace around it, and I'm going to do that after I flip it around. So I've got the soles of both moccasins the same size, and I'll put those on the bottom of each foot, and that'll ensure these feet being the same size. They shrink a little bit because they're small in the mold. This way I can get them up to the same size and the size that I want them. Both of them are going to be the same. So I'll put that sole in place, and then I can fill to that sole, just like the hoof on the horse and the buffalo. That's the way I do it. And I can fill around the toe and get the top done second. Fit that paper right where I want it, chase it in, and shape that moccasin top to the bottom. Now I've got them both dry, and so now I'll go back and I'll remove some of that paper at the top where it got a little thick and wet it and chase it and shape it. Doesn't really take very long to do this. I'm bending that toe up, give it a little more life in that foot. This kind of chasing and sculpting is really what makes each piece and edition unique. Now I'll smooth it with some more paper after I've cut around it and shape that moccasin the way I want it. Now, while those are drying, I'm going to work on the hands again. There's a real benefit to working this way in this paper on small things, because it gives you a chance to really look at it and to really make a difference in these small areas. When the hands are attached, sometimes it's hard to get in there and really do this kind of thing and shape the way you want. These hands are just 1/6 life size. I'm cutting away some of these areas that were cast that I don't want. That's part of the bow. Still getting that out, because I'm going to sculpt the bow separately and put it in his hand. Now we'll dry that and go to work on the hand again. After it's dry. Go between the knuckles. Carve it and shape it. Look at my own hand to check it against the one I'm sculpting. Make sure that my hand looks like the one I'm sculpting, or vice versa, I guess is what I want to say. Now, wet it and let it soak in. Burnish it, get between those fingers on the hand. Shape the bottom of it. Hands are hard to do, especially when they're really small. I get usually some pretty good results this way. I see a lot of small sculptures where the hands aren't done very well, and it's because they're hard, especially in some of the mediums that artists have to work with. Some of them aren't the same size. Some of their feet aren't the same size. So I use certain techniques to try to get things right. And he's going to be holding that bow that way with the arrow between his hand and finger. And I'll shape that arm a little bit. And I got a little speck in there I'm going to take out. Probably a little piece of the abaca in there, which won't hurt it, but I usually take those out. Abaca sometimes has some little brown specks, and that's what also makes the paper stronger. We mix that abaca in our formula, and the abaca sheet is a real strong sheet, real hard sheet. But it has little specks to it. Sometimes you might see that in there, and if you don't like them, take them out. And that's what I do. There aren't that many of them. Now I'm shaping that arm still. I'll be drying that in a little bit. Hit it with the big paddle burnisher. Now we'll dry that, work on the other hand. This is the hand that's holding the feathered end of the arrow. It's posed a little different than the other hand. These two fingers are holding the bowstring, and this hand is holding the feathered end of the arrow. Now I'm going to cut apart this excess where I'm going to reattach the arm, kind of get the elbow on the inside and the outside sculpted in. Smooth the bottom a little bit. And now I'll dry that hand. And his face is dry, and I'm going to wet it and do some more work on it. We'll let that soak in a little bit, and then I'll hit it with a burnisher. And press in hard and really get some smoothing done that way. Use touch just like you would any other sculpture tool with clay, or if you're sculpting on bronze, then you're really probably touching it different depending on the tool you're using. Metal's very hard, and you got to grind it and hammer it, and paper just kind of press in on a little bit and push it, smooth a little bit lightly with a burnisher. And take a little small piece of paper here and fold it over. Fill in some of these areas on his forehead that I can shape. Work around the eyes. Using this small dental burnisher. It's got a tip like that tuck tool burnisher. We have some plastic tools too that'll do that. But I can press a little harder with that dental burnisher, or the tuck tool burnisher, and of course the wood burnishers. And right there I'm using an awl where the arrow is going to be placed in his mouth. Working small, there's a real advantage to being able to hold the sculpture in your hand. It's hard, and I don't have to worry about messing some soft area up. Where I'm working wet, I'm holding where it's dry. And I don't have arms and hands in the way. Now we'll work in these eyelids. I'll just put a little torn piece of paper in there, and I can sculpt those eyes a little better. With that little tool. A little more paper on his nose. I'm going to give him a kind of an eagle beak type shape to that nose. bring it out a little bit. It gives me a little more paper around there to work on the nostrils too. And a little piece on the other side for the other eye. Work that in. And I can dry that for a few minutes, go back to work on it, and work on the hands some more if I want, or the buffalo, or whatever I want to work on. Here, still working on the face, but after it gets pretty hydrated, then I'll have to dehydrate a little bit. And it really doesn't take long for it to dry where I can work on it again. Now I want to cut some more off of this. I'm getting a little dangerous there. I'm going to use my padded cutting board, turn it around and cut away from myself, and remove some of that paper there where I can reattach the braids after I've put in the hair as strands. There'll be a little more that I put back on there that I can attach the braids to. So I'll cut that off, and that's the way I want it to look, so I can put the hair on. With the tuck tool burnisher, I'm working around the eyes, getting the lids shaped the way I want. Kind of define where the eyebrows are. And brush in and get those cheekbones high. Work around the nostrils. When the paper's dry like that and you work hard on it, do some of this hard shaping and burnishing, it's pretty permanent. It's not going to change on you. If you want to smooth it, then you can wet it and smooth it some more. The face has come a long way and not too long a time. And it's getting very close. Being the way I want it. Now I'll do some more work on his body. Getting the anatomy the way I want it. Those muscles and tendons in the neck, right? And do a little smoothing with some thin paper and some burnishing on top of that. The thin paper is almost like adding skin over skin, and you can really smooth with it, like a number 2 sheet or even a number 1 sheet. really helps to do that final finish on it. Almost looks like skin when you're done. Putting a muscle in his neck by rolling the paper, and it's the way, almost the way a muscle is. And then I can go over top of that with some more paper, let that muscle telegraph through. And I'll do a little more here on that muscle that turns the head in front. It's attached to the clavicle. Shape that in. Work on the shoulders. Still got some work to do on his body, but I'll dry him for now and go back to work on the hands. Hands are really coming up to where I want them to be. Doing some hard burnishing there. Now I'm going to get that finger that's holding the arrow posed the way I want it. I'll just cut under it and lift it up a little bit. Cut the other side, lift it. I've got to get an arrow underneath there. Now I've got to do a little anatomical correction on that finger. I'll get that sculpted in. When you lift it there, you get a little divot. So I filled that divot. And underneath where I cut it. Now, this is the other hand. It's holding the arrow. The feathered end of the arrow. This hand is close to his face. He's looking down that shaft of the arrow. The rider's looking down the shaft of the arrow. Now I'm going to give him some fingernails. So with my X-Acto knife, I just kind of do a little cut around where the fingernail would be, and then I can shape it with my dental tool. And I'll do that with all 8 fingers and both thumbs. That's a little soft there. You can see it kind of bending in. Good to use a nice sharp knife here. That one on the index finger I've already started a little bit. define a little bit more here. Work in those muscles on his forearm. Get those defined. This is the arm that's holding the bow. I'll make it nice and strong looking. And now I've taken a real thin piece of paper that I've cut, and I'm tearing it up. These are going to be the veins in his hands. So I wet his hand. There's a drawing I have of kind of where the veins go on the hands, and I just flopped it for the other hand. Same drawing. There's anatomy to veins too. There's a little divot there. Just at the wrist, where the wrist and the hand are when hands pose a certain way. You'll see that. Pick up those little torn pieces of paper, and I look at my drawing, and I just place these little pieces of paper in where the veins show up in my drawing. I just imitate that. People notice things like this, a little detail. They look for it because you can put so much detail in with the paper. You don't have to end it just with a hand. You can put veins on the hand and the arms. So we'll get that one drying and do the other one. And here's the other one. You can see how wet that is. That's the way I do it, because the paper, when you put it in, you wet it, it just soaks in. Then you can move it around a little bit, bend those little pieces so they look like veins. Using the tactile burnisher here to just push it and pull it and get it where I want it to be. Here, an X-Acto knife. On the screen, that hand looks about the size of a real hand, but the hand that I'm working on is actually 6 times smaller. Now we'll dry that. We got them both dried, and you can see they really show up. So I'll wet those, and then I'll burnish them a little bit, flatten them down a little bit, just so they don't quite stick out so much. I got a little speck of my cutting board on there. I'll take that off. Now we're going to put skin over those veins. This number 2 sheet. And those veins will telegraph through and just starts looking like a real hand. And that's what collectors like. So now we'll dry those. And after they dried, I'll give them one last burnishing. Just work in that detail just the way I want it. take off any sharp edges that I don't want. Now, what we're going to do here is cut some hair, and some very thin hair. This is a thin hard sheet. What you do, take a thin sheet, attach it to a strip of mat board with some masking tape to stop your scissors at the end so you get a strand that's attached. There's several strands that is attached to one strand. That's one way to do it. That's the way I used to do it. This is the way I do it now. My 2P cap. You'll need to look for this. That's a clip of the old prototype, but it's one of our EFA special tools. So this is hair, and what I'm going to do is finish this horse. I've got it cut about 10 inches long, and I'll take some strands and I'll try to straighten it out with my fingers. I'll wet the tip of the tail, and I'll wet that little bit of paper that I've cut, and I'm going to attach it to the tip of his tail. And I'm going to make that hair grow out of his tail that I attached. Sculpted and attached. We'll do this with the buffalo too. And work my way up that tail. There's an end where they're all attached. The other half, oh, stuck to my fingers. Just stick it back, not a big deal. That 2P cat is a tool that you're going to want, so look for that. It's coming out very soon. If it's not out by the time you get this, it's going to be out. We have that going into production, and it just straps to a one-arm paper cutter, self-sharpening paper cutter. And you can see as I get to closer to the rump on this tail, I make these attachments a little shorter. There's an anatomy to a tail too, and right where it attaches to the rump, it's already wet, so I'll just use a tuck tool burnisher and chase it in there. And we'll do the mane next. And when that dries, I can give it a do. I've been kind of giving it a do already, but I can take it in my hands and do that. Now, where the hair goes into the neck, I'm going to open up that slit again, and I'm going to cut some hair to go in there, short, wet where I cut it, lay that short piece in there halfway across, and use this little trowel, painter's trowel, and press it in there. And I do this whether the hair is flying, like this flying detail, or if I lay it down. If it's a standing horse, you can do this and then give it a do so it just kind of lays to the side of his neck. And as I work up the neck, it'll get a little longer. Notice I don't use too much as I go. Take my time. Now I'm giving him a little do, making it blow the way I want. Giving him some bangs here by his head, by his ears, pressing it in. And then I can take little shorter ones, wet them and lay them in under. This is kind of fun. I always like this part of it. Well, I like all of this, but that's kind of fun. And people just don't know how you do it. But now you know. And now my running horse is complete with flying mane and tail. I can twist it around and really get some dimension to that. Now I'll dry that. Now we can give this rider a do. I've got him a little closer on his body and face where I want it. So I'll give him some hair, and I'm going to do that the same kind of hair that I did with the horse, cut a little thinner. I'm going to find where the part is and give him a little groove there, reinforce what's already there with my knife. And there you can see it up close. And I'll take a little bit of paper and fill these holes where the screws were in his head. I could cover those with hair, but I'd rather do it now and make sure they're covered. And I can do a little more work on his neck here. Now I'm going to take this hair that's cut about just to the end of where the braids are going to start, and I'll lay it in. His head is wet, and I can use my tuck tool burnisher to lay it down onto that bonding agent, and the brush it in. Now I've got separate strands, and this detail is going to lay down pretty much here. I can make it, if he's not wearing braids, then I might do it more like I did the mane on the horse, but he's going to have braids, so I'll paint this on and bring it into the side of his head where the sideburns would go, and go over that. I used small cuts, and now I'm going over it with longer ones. Held those small ones with tweezers. Like right there. And then I go over it with some longer hair. Laying it down into the wet bonding agent and letting it fuse in. And I'm giving this rider a do. Working on the back of his head, holding it with the tweezers and laying it in. Yeah, actually, every strand of hair is a sculpture, if you think about it. Each one was cut, put in. Kind of a strand at a time when you do it this way. Sticking to my duck-tool burnisher there. Now I'm going to cut it while it's wet real carefully because it's starting to lay down on the dry shoulder and I don't want that to happen. So that hair in there just the way I want it. And that's where the braids are going to be attached. I'm going to make some braid wraps. I'm using real thin paper there with some thicker bonding agent, and I'm going to roll it around a tube. See, that blue container is my thick bonding agent. And I'll just roll it around this tube. And that's going to be a wrap for his braids. Now I'm going to take a thin strip of paper and wrap that around what I've rolled on the little tube. And this will read as a wrap. The thin paper underneath really is just to give this detail a base. You can see I spliced it together. I'm rolling a lot more than I need here. I'll use this on another sculpture, the remainder of it. I won't need this much, but better to have a little more than not enough. Wet it there and roll it around, and I'll dry that. Now, these are some strips of paper, kind of like the mane on the horse, and I've got 3 separate ones that I'm fusing together with the bonding agent, and I'm going to do that again. This is the hair that I'm going to braid for his braids, so I want them to be about the same length and to be attached to one another at one end, and there they are. And I'm going to dry those. Now, this is some leather sheet that I have, and I'm using my hole punch, and I'm going to put some special anatomy on my rider, on his breasts there. His nipples. And this is how I cut strips with my 2P cat. I can cut them so they aren't attached, or I can cut them so they stay attached like the hair. And there's some strips. And what I'm going to do with these strips is dip them in my bonding agent, pin them on one end of a foam board, and because they're wet, then I can twist those. These are what I call twisty tassels. And I'll do several of these, and I'll dry those. Now I'm taking my dried braid hair, and I'm fastened at the corner of my work table there, and I am going to use a small vise to do that, just to hold it. Patty uses masking tape, but I gotta pull it harder than she does. I just don't braid as well as she does, and so I do it this way. If you're more delicate, you could probably use masking tape to hold it. And I've always done it this way. And I just braid that like I used to braid my little daughter's hair. And then at the end, I can take some of those strips that I cut, and I can wrap that, and it'll hold it. When I wet it, it holds it a little bit, but I'll just wrap that around, and I'll create this actual detail, just like I create all the other actual detail. When I sculpt for bronzes, I actually create actual detail that becomes molded in detail. A lot of artists use actual detail. They may use actual weapons that they mold for bronzes. Now these are those little braids that I made, braid holders. That's it. Took it off the tube, and now I'm cutting it the length that I want. There's my twisty ribbons, or twisty tassels. And I'll cut those and stick them together and put them on the end toward the where I wrap that. Now I'm taking this and that wrap, and I'm cutting it so it's narrow at one end. I'll overlap it so it's narrow at one end, thicker where it's going to be holding this hair up by his head, and I'm going to make that a little smaller there. But what I do is I wrap that all together, and then I can put it on there and make those tassels blow. Now I'll give him a navel. He's got a nice set of abs. Six-pack. Now I took some bender board and I rolled that. You know the drill by now. And I'm going to reattach his arms. With the inside, slide it in. And then I can sculpt over that paper that I just reattached. Fill in where it needs to be and make my anatomical corrections, and burnish it in. You can see why I left the braid off of this one side. I still have work to do here, and I just didn't want that braid in the way, but I did want to make sure it worked the way I wanted it to work. I don't like surprises. Now we'll dry that, and then I can go back in and shape that arm. Do some final shaping on that. and burnish over that with some paper. Now I can reattach the other arm. Put my post in and the arm. And go over top of that. Now I have both his arms on and doing the final sculpting, chasing, burnishing on that, getting the muscles in the way I want. That little tricep. I'm going to dry that. Now I'm going to do something really radical. I'm doing a technique I call altered cast. I want to repose this figure on the horse. So I'm going to cut him in half. This is my razor saw after I've marked it with my burnisher. You can see how thick he is there. Now I'm going to take a little more off because I want to turn him at the waist. He's coming up behind the buffalo. I decided while I was doing this project that I wanted to show you how to do this as a relief rather than a pedestal piece. So I have to pose the rider differently. He's coming up behind the buffalo instead of being beside it. So I have to change the anatomy. So goodbye six-pack. I'm going to have to sculpt those in again. So I'm just going to reattach these pieces that I cut off with a tube, bender board, and some pretty thin paper. And I'll put that in, test it first. Make sure it's going to work with all of my slices. And now I'm going to turn him so he's posed the way he should be, coming up behind the buffalo. He's taking aim. He's coming up fast. He'll come up beside the buffalo and he'll turn some more and place the arrow between his ribs, like in the pedestal piece. But he's not there yet. In this piece, he's still approaching that buffalo. So that's why I'm reposing him. So I can do this as a wall hanging rather than pedestal piece. And I want him coming up behind rather than beside because I just don't want that deep of a relief on the wall. This way I can make it 9 inches instead of 13 inches. So I'll press that in and push it in, get it shaped the way I want. Put some paper in there to hold everything. I got some underneath and around. And I gotta resculpt this now. that's what you can do with this medium. You can take your casts and alter them. That's what I've been doing all along, but this is a pretty radical change, completely changing the pose. And I'll turn that so his abs kind of go on an angle the way they should. His spine is opposite to his abs, and it goes on an angle too. And I'm going to press that down and get that paper all to bond. When it dries, it's going to really fuse together hard. And I'm getting it the way I think I want it. I want him aimed more frontal rather than to the side. So I have him posed nearly the way I think I want him. This is the Buffalo Bull. Now he's going to be in the relief version in front of the rider. So I'm going to put my sculpture of the man on the horse. And you can see mortised in below on the left, lower left, my original sculpture. That's a 13-inch wide pedestal piece. I didn't want that deep of a relief, so this way I can make it 9 inches. I'm bringing him up behind the Buffalo Bull. That's why I reposed him. I've got him now. I made those final adjustments going through that exercise. I got him exactly the way I want him. So now I'm going to go ahead and finish burnishing out and sculpting in this rider. So I'm going to take my ready sheets and sculpt them in where I want them. I know when he's dry I can come back and cut apart the excess that I don't want. So I'm going to sculpt in what I think I need, burnish that down, sculpt it in, and let it dry, and then come back and cut away the excess. So that's what I'm doing here, is getting all that right. Filling in around his abs, those ribs in the front. Trying to help myself ahead of time here by getting as much as I can right now. This doesn't take as long as you would think. It's pretty fast, but now he's completely changed. I've completely changed that pose. I'm going to dry him. That's what you can do with this medium. You can make limited edition originals with your molds and make changes that you want to make at will. Really make those differences. I'm sculpting in those abs. Again, giving him that nice six-pack that he had before. On this new pose, cutting away what I don't want and sculpting it in. Now I'm back. I've got that all done, and I'm putting on this last braid. The braid that goes over his right shoulder. Now he's got 2 flying braids. I just slipped it on with a little bonding agent in there, and it's fused. Now I'm looking at him. A lot of that is going to be covered, so I'm going to work on his moccasins now. These are bead strips that I'm going to put on his moccasins. And I'm going to trim those out and put them around the bottom rim of his moccasins. We have these bead casts if you want them. They're pretty cool if you are doing this kind of work. I'm going to wet around the rim of his moccasin, around the sole, and apply this. So I'm going to wet it. And I wet around the bottom, and I'm now just putting it on with my fingers. I don't want to press too hard because I don't want to smash those beads, especially if they soaked in too much. But I'm getting them just like they were on the original sculpture. We'll get into place with my knife. It's a little longer than I need it to be, so I'll cut a little off. And now you can see close up on that. And I usually cut them off on the inside. I can match them pretty good. Even though I cut them, you can't tell if I sculpt it in. But I like to do it on the inside. That's where it's least likely to be seen. These are round beads to decorate the top of the moccasin. I've decorated the whole moccasin with beads before, but these are not as dressy because he's on a buffalo hunt. And I'll get the other one. Now, if you wet a little piece of paper strip, then you can make a bow and tie that bow and attach it to the moccasin. You see his left moccasin there, that's the one on the right, already has one. It's his left moccasin. So I got it tied, and I'll wet the moccasin, I'll wet the bow, and then I'll press it in and attach that. These are going to be tongues. So I'll cut a little fringe on the tongue, and then I'll lay that over top of the bow. And do that on both sides. Now this is the top part of the moccasin that's kind of folded over, and I wet that, give it position in the right place. The bonding agent just works so well that the leather strips in our other hard paper and similar hard paper where it just kind of fuses in. Now I'm going to kind of fold the end up, give it a little life there. And now I'm cutting the bottom fringe to his leggings. I'm just going to sculpt this in, overlap that moccasin a little bit, because the anatomy of that moccasin wasn't exactly right, but it's not usually the way I do it, but because it's covered, I can do it that way, and the part that sticks out looks right. So I overlap that on his leggings, and you can see I have a little ridge there that I'm going to go over. And this is the top part of his leggings where it kind of bows a little bit out. The leggings aren't like pants. There's no crotch to them. The crotch is made up by his breechcloth, which I'll put on in a little bit. Back to the Toopy cat. Now I'm cutting fringe, and you can see that the fringe stays attached in this adjustment. Now I'll cut grass this way and hair, and this is a leather sheet that I'm cutting. And you can see I actually doubled it over so I get 2 sets of fringe. That's the way I do it. Do grass that way too. So maximize the effort. Then I wet the part that all the fringe strips are attached to, and I wet his legging, and I lay that on top, starting at the bottom because it's going to overlap the bottom when I fold it to his knees. A little long there, so I'll cut off what I don't need. And then I'll press it into those folds with my burnisher or tuck tool burnisher, and do the other side the same way. Now I'm going to cover up that little ridge with some paper where I attach that leather at the bottom of his leggings. And actually looks like I made those leggings and put them on him. Okay, now I'm working on the legs of the buffalo. So pretty much like the horse, I'm doing my carving with my knife, getting off those extra lumps of paper that I don't want, and wetting the leg with my bonding agent, and then taking a ready sheet, putting over top, burnishing it in, cutting pieces of paper that are the same length, about the same areas that I want to cover. I'll just tear those off. They're torn and feathered in with my burnisher. Now I'm tracing out a hoof. This is my technique for getting them all the same size. I'm using that same laminated piece of paper, that board that I created for my horse's hoof bottom. I want to flatten this out, so I'm going to take my knife. That's where the 2 parts of the cast of that leg came together. Fold that ready sheet over and fill that area, and then I'm putting a bigger one on top, flattening that out so I can put the cut board from my template there to flatten out the bottom of that hoof. Now the difference between a horse's hoof and a buffalo's hoof, of course, is the buffalo has a split hoof. So I let the 2 casts seam right there. I don't put it together like I did the horse, where I try to flatten it out. I just left it so I have kind of a crease there already, and then I'll reinforce that by sculpting on top, and then the anatomy of that hoof on the front is correct. And I build it toward the bottom, filling around it and getting getting it filled in underneath, so it's going to be the same as the others. I'll dry that and go to work on the front hoofs. Now these are just little sections that I took off because that leg is bent on that sculpture and I didn't have to do a lot. Now I'm working on the mountain leg of the buffalo, so I've taken the whole sculpture off the stand, and basically I'm doing the same thing here, except that hoof at the bottom, I had to put a hole in it for the mount, that stainless steel mount, and now I'm filling around it using the tuck tool burnisher to push the paper in, just to get it flat and in place. So I'm using the paper for the bottom, and then I'll dry that, and after it's dried, then I'll whittle that hoof to the same size as the others with that template laminated piece that's at the bottom of the hoof. And here I'm working on one of the front legs and splitting that hoof. You're going to see the bottom, so I'll show you how I do that. I make sure I have a split there, and I've got it cut out. So the anatomy in the bottom of the hoof is right. And then I can work that in. And those little humps in the back where the back toes are. Now I'm going to put some eyes on this buffalo and make his nose symmetrical. I just used little lumps of paper. I'm trying to make the face symmetrical, where the two halves of the cast fit together, and I had a little distortion there that I've corrected. Now I'm making this buffalo a bull. So I've got two little round beads that I've made. You can make those out of paper by rolling them in your hands or whatever you want. A section of a paper tube. Now I've fit his testicles in place that I just sculpted. And now I'm back to working on the legs of this buffalo, and I'm reattaching those. Getting them where I want. Got the legs pretty much sculpted out. I like to do the legs first and put those on. I can work on the body at the same time the legs are off, and then I reattach them and sculpt them in seamlessly. And it's just a fast way of working. You might find it easier for you to leave them on if you're used to working that way. You should work the way that's comfortable to you. You don't have to necessarily do it the way I do it. Patty does a lot of things different than I do, but she gets to the same place. And it's whatever makes sense to you. But basically what you want to do is you want to sculpt, and you want it to look right when you're done. And look to where it pleases you. Like the song goes, you can't please everyone, but you got to please yourself. And you're not going to be happy if you're forced into doing something someone else's way. I know that. But I just think it's a good way for me to do it. And a lot of artists that I've taught this to they like it too. Okay, now this is his front left hoof that I'm reattaching right about the ankle, putting that in place and sculpted it in seamlessly, so it's finished. Now I'll go and do the same with the one on the right. Now I'm going to attach the tail that I sculpted, do a little final burnishing, wetting it, getting it the way I want it, putting in some wrinkles there where the tail bends. I'm cutting a hole right where that tail belongs. Wet the stump of the tail and push it into that hole. Now I've got the tail in place, so I want to make it look seamless too, so I'm going to burnish some ready sheets around that and sculpt it out so it fits that backbone. The tail is just really the extension of a backbone. I'm sure you realize that. So I'm bringing paper in on the bottom too, and now that tail's in place. This is real thin paper. It's like the skin going on. Number 2 sheet, just painting it on, letting some of those nuances come through, and I'll do some burnishing and some more dry burnishing and wet burnishing to bring it up the way I want. Now those are those little humps that are on the back of the ankle where the back toes are. Those are back toes, actually toes on the buffalo, and I've cut some little round sections of paper that I rolled and cut them on an angle, fit them in those holes, and now those are the little toenails that protrude out on the back of the hoof of split-hoofed animals. All the split-hoofed animals that I can think of have those. And a little piece of paper to cover up where the hole is from that wire, from rolling that paper over the wire. I have lots of those little, I call them paper dowels. I'm not sure if that's the right term for them, but that's what I call them. And working on the horns of this buffalo and the eyes. Now I'm going to create an eye lid by taking some a little ready sheet, folding it in half and rolling it under. That's the bottom lid, and then I'm going to do the top lid the same way, and the lids on the top overlap the ones on the bottom. And then I'm going to open that eye with the eye lid, because eyes kind of stick out on a lot of animals. And then another lid where it folds over. And I know this is right on a startled buffalo because I've been right there when they've been inoculated and seen the terror in their eyes, and they're open wide and they look like that. Okay, this is something really cool. I've taken a thick sheet of paper, it's like a number 5 sheet, and I've taped it down to a board. And I use a straight blade, and I just scrape it across there to create fluff. And I'm going to make a woolly buffalo by wetting the buffalo and picking that fluff up off of my sheet. My ready sheet of fluff, and I'm laying it right down on the bonding agent that's on that buffalo and sculpting it in. And giving him kind of a do with that fluff. And now I've taken that ear hole out, and I'm going to make an ear, because we didn't cast the ears on the buffalo or the horse. So I've taken a sheet of leather paper, folding it in half, make it a little thicker. Now I'm going to fold that in half that's been laminated, and I'm going to cut one cut, and I'm going to get 2 ears out of this. Now watch the way that I do this. I shape that ear kind of like a rounded triangle. I got it about the right size, and because it's rounded and because it's long enough, I can manipulate that to be sticking out of that ear hole as far as I want. Now I'm going to fold it over kind of into itself to create that ear. Wet the hole, wet the ear, and stick it in. Hold it with my knife. Now you can see where the lamination is, but I'm going to cover that with fluff so it won't be seen. Chase it in, get it back because he's scared and his ears are back. He's running. He's running for his life. He's a big old bull and he's not as fast as he used to be, but that warrior needs hide for his teepee and meat for his village, and it's a way of life. And then the other side, I do the same thing and put it in. A lot of times I'll sculpt the horns too, especially on some of our casts that don't have horns. Now I'm fluffing out that buffalo. A little different than the horse, but the ears were pretty much the same way, and the eyes. Now I'm going to freeze that fluff with a spray of white glue or acrylic mixed with water, thin. And I'm taking the hair that I cut, like the horse, from my Toopy cat, and putting that little wisp of hair on the tip of the tail of the buffalo, using tweezers to do that here. That Toopy cat, 2 P's is precision paper and cat cutting assist tool. Toopy cat. That's what I call it. And since I invented it, I can call it whatever I want. So I call it a Toopy cat. Anyway, it sure is a great tool. And if you want to do a lot of this, then you should have that tool. So look for it. And I'm putting hair on the top of his head, giving him a do up there. They have hair up there, fluff on their hump down to their top of their legs, and then they have hair down there too, and I'm going to do that when I finish his head, and applying it with tweezers. Looks like it's growing out of his head. And then after it's dry, I can give him a do with my tuck tool burnisher and scissors. Do a little trim. He's got a beard, so I'm going to use some of that hair for his beard too. and using the tweezers to put that in place. Also on the legs, and I start at the bottom of the legs just because it makes sense. Kind of like shingling a roof. Top hairs have to overlap the bottom hairs, so the bottom hairs have to go on first. And then I'll use some of that fluff and blend it into those hairs. Just kind of sculpt that in. And I got to do it on both sides. And also little underneath, just to finish off the detail so it looks real. And finishing it off on the other side. Now I can give his little beard a do and his legs a do, and the buffalo is done. So now I need to put a cinch on that horse, and what I've done is I've laminated some paper, some hard paper, leather paper, to create that cinch, make it thick enough. And since it's going to be under the saddle, I don't worry about this part, how it looks. It's just the bottom part. This top part is going to be covered by the rider. And this is the rider. He's pretty much finished except for putting on his breechcloth, which I'm doing here. And this is also hard paper, or semi-hard paper, like the leather paper. And I've cut it, wet it, let it soak in a little bit as it's set there. And now I'm taking a thin kind of a string that I've cut on my Toopy Cat, folded it underneath that strip for the breechcloth. Give it that reality. The breechcloth actually goes under that kind of belt and through his crotch and then back out the other side. And this is the way I put it on, and I work those folds in there. And I'll do the same thing for the back. Get those folds the way I want them, and now I'm going to put it on the back of him. The back part of the breechcloth, and that string, that leather string, kind of holds up his leggings and holds the breechcloth all in one, gives him kind of pants. Wet the bottom where the saddle is and the top of the horse. Now I'm going to put that rider right in place. Covering the cinch, covering the back of the buffalo. And then I can kind of, because it's wet, I can make those breechcloth sections that I just sculpted in look the way I want them to. I can fold it around the saddle. I can make him flying. Get him seated right where I want him. And because I wet it, it's going to fuse in place and he won't come off of there. Now I'm going to fold that back breechcloth kind of the way I want, flip it up on one end, give it a little life. Now I'm cutting a bead strip, and these are going to go on his leggings. And we have these bead strips that you can order. Trim it up and cut it in half. Those are in sections. And for this size, I can do this. Give it a nice wide strip of beads on his leggings. Get it even. Wet the back of the cast. Wet where those are going to go over that fringe that I cut. And lay that bead strip right where I want it. Bend it around the knee. Bring it back a little longer than I want, so I'll cut that off. Take my scissors and cut it off. And my dental tool or tuck tool burnisher works the same way. I use that almost interchangeably for this application. Get it the way I want it. Give that fringe a do. Have it flying. I call that flying detail, as opposed to molded in detail or whatever. This is a belt, and it's a thicker sheet of paper, leather sheet. The belt has it's just a regular belt of leather, and it has two holes on the ends where the buckle would go, and then some leather strips going through those holes, and they just tie a bow on those two. There's one, and then one on top and one on the bottom, and that's kind of his belt, and then and belt buckle, and then same for the strips that hold the breechcloth in place. And these are actually leather sections that are attached to his leggings. It's part of his leggings, and I'm making those go up underneath his belt where the breechcloth strips hold him in place. And he has his knife there on his belt. And this is little leather strips that or sections of saddle flying that I'm adding on both sides. It's just leather. Give it a little more flair. So it's flying. And I've got it underneath. I just add these leather sheets, and here I'm opening up the horse's mouth to put in the reins. This is how they do it at the foundry. Basically, same way. You got to put a hole there. Now, I wet it. They use heat and a pair of needle nose to twist that wire. I do it in paper, they do it in metal. I put those reins in the holes. I push it in, and now he's got a war bridle, reins in his mouth, and tighten it up. And tighten it up with heat, and I twist it, do the same thing, tie a little string around there, tighten it up. Here I'm opening up his hand because I'm going to put a bow in it. And I'm going to put a Sharp's carbine on his back. He's taking the bull with the bow, not the rifle. And the quiver and bow case. You can see how I created all those accessories on the Accessories and Miniatures DVD. And that's what it looks like in metal. Taking his needle nose and twisting it, basically doing the same thing I'm doing here. Only I can do a lot more detail, obviously. People love the detail. Now here's his bow. I opened up his hand. I'm going to put the bow in. And then I'll close his hand up, back up. And chase some paper around that thumb. And now he's holding the bow with the string in his other hand. Here I got metal in that arrow. I'm going to leave it in. Just makes it a little bit stronger. Push it in. Metal inside that shaft of the arrow, and then I put it right where it belongs, between his fingers. The fingers on the hand that's holding the arrow. That would be his right hand, and the finger that guides the arrow on his left. Now I'm going to give him his feather headdress with tassel. Put that on his head. Push it on. It'll fuse. And there's a little detail here on his Sharp's carbine. I want to put a little screw there, a little notch for the screw. And some fluff on his headdress. These feathers, you'll see how I made those on the Accessories and Miniatures DVD. And you can watch that next if you want to. This arrow, this one's got to go in his mouth. So I'm going to put a little pad of paper after I put that wire in the end, and then I'm going to cut it with my needle nose. And I'm going to show you how they do it at the foundry. No surprise, they do it pretty much the same way I do it.
The feather side is across his arm, and the point side is across his shoulder.
I'm just telling them where I want it. Point side across his shoulder, I said, and the feather side across his arm. So he's heating it up. And he's fusing it in place there. Takes him a little longer to do what I do in paper. But he gets it done, and it looks good when he's done. It's nice bronze. To do that, I sealed my paper. I sculpted the whole thing with my starter casts, posed them and sculpted it out, sealed the paper, and did the molding, and then bronze editions and paper editions with the same molds. Point side across his shoulder and feather side across his arm. Pretty fast. And it'll stay in there. It's not going to come out. I like to leave the metal in there simply because it's stronger and I can. And there's my rider. photographed him on the acrylic, clear acrylic, get light underneath him and all around him. Go all the way around him and these stills and show you all the detail on that rider. Sharp's carbine, bow case, quiver, his knife, bow and arrow. And here's the buffalo. A lot of detail on him too. Real fluff, real hair. Actual detail as opposed to molded in detail. That's what you can do. And if you want to go to the accessories and miniatures DVD, go there and you'll see how I made those. Or go to the base sculpting and mounting DVD and you'll see how I finished this piece and framed it up. Also on that DVD you'll see as a bonus at the end a half life-size sculpture we did of Brad Pitt in the movie Troy for Ripley's Entertainment that's in their Hollywood Museum. And I did a quarter life-size dancer that's in the Great Plains Art Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska. Both these I did with starter casts and finished them out with our soft and hard paper to create all the detail. In the quarter life-size traditional dancer doing the prairie chicken dance, I even show you how to create clothes.
The Eckman Method is not papier-mâché, and the techniques cannot be duplicated with other store-bought papers, glues, or bonding agents. We developed this medium over time by formulating our acid-free handmade paper and bonding agent together, and there is no substitute.